Let's start the recording. So far, we have talked about the research process and the research questions and research problems. We've talked about how to write a literature review. And I hope that those things are clear because now we are moving on to our methodology and data collection, right? So if you were doing an empirical study, a qualitative study, you would be collecting data from different sources, right? Data collection is done through a number of instruments. We call them instruments, we call them research methods, we call them tools. So the name is not important, you should know the concept, right? And one of those tools is research interviews, right? It's a very common research tool, research interviews, and today we are going to talk about that. We've talked about qualitative research in literature. Right, so we've talked about empirical data-based studies include qualitative research studies. I hope everyone remembers what is a qualitative study. Are we all clear on the difference between qualitative and quantitative, and empirical and non-empirical? Quick comments in the chat, please. Samra says yes. What about the others? Okay, Halimat, thank you. Aviva, Sajad, Zainab, Misbah, how about you guys? Okay, all right, so I'm getting a number of responses here. That's good. All right, fine, that's good. So I've given some examples on the slide about qualitative studies that can be done in the field of literature. The first one is readers' perceptions on including old poetry in the syllabus. So if you were doing a study on this topic, you will be collecting data qualitatively. If you were doing a study on students' perceptions of religion after reading Waiting for Godot, you will be doing it qualitatively. Students' responses to learning fiction in final year, since we're talking about response or perception, we will do it qualitatively. We will collect data qualitatively. Moving on. Methods for data collection. In qualitative research, we can use the following tools to collect data. We can use observations. We can use questionnaires with open-ended questions. Do we know the difference between open-ended and closed-ended questions? Can somebody please tell the difference between open-ended and closed-ended? Parvasha, could you please open your mic and tell us the difference between closed-ended and open-ended questions? Okay, closed-ended. Faiza, could you please speak up? Faiza or Etazaz, one of you.
Assalamu alaikum, ma'am.
Walaikum assalam. Yes, Etazaz. Could you please explain open-ended and closed-ended questions?
Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, closed-ended questions are those where we have a specific options in answers to select one of the option. And that open-ended questions are those where a student have to write a statement in answer.
Right. Yes, exactly. Thank you, Etazaz. Open-ended questions are those which require descriptive answers, and closed-ended have either yes or no, true or false, or there are options to select from: strongly agree, agree, disagree, or like age, certain age limits are given and you have to select from it. That's also a closed-ended question. Okay. So whenever we have open-ended questions in questionnaires, those are qualitative. Okay, that's a qualitative research tool. And interviews are most of the time qualitative. All right. Interviews and questionnaires are more common instruments of data collection in empirical studies in literature. Students from literature side usually use interviews and questionnaires. Um, Students find questionnaires and interviews easy at BS or MA level. Um, can you give me an example of how interviews can be used in a study related to literature? Can you guys think of any topics as examples where you would use interviews? Many of you have thought of those topics when you were designing your research questions, and when you were thinking about your literature review, you have given topics to me. So can you give any examples of topics where interviews will be used? Quick responses in the chat, please. Okay, readers' perceptions about whenever we start a question like that. Yes, that's right, Tazaz. That's good. Any others? Any others related to teaching of literature? Something around those lines? Others' opinion on on any literature piece? Yes. We'll be choosing people who have been reading different genres or any specific genre. Okay. All right, so we have some idea about when interviews will be used. Now let's see how we would conduct interviews. Okay. We do qualitative research whenever we are interested in understanding people in detail and whenever we want in-depth data. Now, in qualitative research, we collect data from fewer participants as compared to quantitative research. When you study a quantitative research, you would see that there is data from hundreds of participants. There is data from more than 100, sometimes 200, sometimes even 600, and large scale studies would be even larger because their answers are so short that people can do it quickly and then they can get more response, and the quantity is important, right? Whereas in qualitative research, we are interested in depth. We are interested in getting rich data. We want each person to tell us things in detail. So that is why we collect data from fewer participants. Okay. Some researcher bias is present in qualitative research as compared to quantitative. There would be some more subjectivity, some more researcher bias in qualitative research. Okay, we will talk about that and how to eliminate that, how to reduce it to as much extent as possible. All right, moving on. So this week we will discuss conducting research interviews. I hope you have read chapter 16, interviews, on page 349 of Cohen. I uploaded that book in your group. Were you able to read it? Anyone who has read it? And how did you find it? Did you find it difficult? Even if you started reading it and you found it difficult, you can tell me that. Or did you find it easy to follow so that I can give you readings accordingly the next time? So I know that what what's your reading level, and I give you readings accordingly. Okay. So what did you think of it? How did you find it? Did you read it? Not read it? It was an easy read. Okay. All right. Thank you, Aisha. How about others? Bit lengthy. Okay. All right. Saiduddin, how about you? Did you read it? It was easy but lengthy, all right. Dua? Said, next time please try and read it, see if you understand it, okay? So we need to know if you are able to follow. All right. Ali Raza, how about you? Prakash, Akash, Aliza? All right. So those of you who have read it think that it was easy, but it was lengthy. All right. So we cannot really do much about the length, but I can specify which parts you need to read the next time. Okay. For observations, I will specify which parts you should read. Okay. What is an interview? So this is how Cohen, Mannion, Morrison define an interview. They say the interview is a flexible tool for data collection enabling multisensory channels to be used: verbal, non-verbal, spoken, and heard. How is non-verbal used in an interview, do you think? What is non-verbal in an interview? Written. What expressions and emotions? Yes, Usman. Gestures by making people perform some tasks, nodding, gestures, expressions. Yes, expressions of the interviewee. Written form is not an interview, okay? Interview is always verbal, it's spoken form. Expressions and body language is what we're talking about, okay? Temur, Zofia, you're right. Temur, what do you mean by symbols? What kind of symbols? Tone, attitude is also non-verbal, yes. So whenever you as a researcher, as an interviewer will be taking an interview, you will observe the other person. You will observe their attitude, their expressions, their body language. Sometimes people smile while giving an answer, so they're saying it sarcastically and you note that down, okay? So as a researcher, you will be observing their body language and expressions and gestures as well, in addition to what they are saying. So that non-verbal part is also there. So interview is a very flexible tool where you can collect data from multi-sensory channels. You can look at them, you can hear them, you can speak, and you can obviously understand what they're trying to say. Okay. Um, yes, Imran, could you put that in the chat for everyone so that everyone can see? It's a good point that you're making. Like if you're making a bad face, bad expression at one point, and then you're smiling at the other, you're speaking emotionally at one point and angry at the other, it helps us discern the impact of question on the interviewee. That's exactly what we are talking about. Okay, moving on. An interview, a research interview is different from a simple conversation because the purpose of research interview is collection of data. It's not like just talking to your friends. When you are collecting data, you would be having specific questions or areas in mind that you need to cover. Interviewers of all kind look for certain kind of response from an interviewee. We are looking for certain things in an interviewee. We are expecting them to answer certain questions, and we are concerned with a specific area. Okay. Please go through the slide. Done? Do we follow what it's saying? Azka, could you explain that? Turn on your mic and explain what it's saying. Imran, put it in the chat for everyone, please. It's still could you all please write it to everyone rather than direct message to me so that everyone can read it? Why? Why does it automatically changes? Select everyone in the meeting from the chat and then do it. Try it again, please. Both Imrans are doing the same thing. All right, that's better, man. Thank you. The interview is concerned with some set of particular questions. Those questions are not ordinary or daily conversation. So what Cohen is saying basically is that an interview is different from other conversations. And yes, Aska.
Yes, you're saying it right. He's saying that interview is not the daily conversation as we talk each other, communicate each other in a very natural way. It is a very organized, pre-planned thing or the medium of communication that a researcher sets or organize to interview for his or her particular research topic. So it is not day-to-day or ordinary language or ordinary answers that a researcher
Exactly.
takes or extracts from the interviewee, but it's an organized and a particular set of the questions and questionnaires that an interviewee may give answers in a very particular manner and not in natural or occurring situations.
Oh, yes, exactly. That's great. Thank you. So in an interview, we ask for specific questions and there are rules that we may need to follow. It's very different from an everyday conversation because the purpose is to collect data. Okay, moving on. When to use interviewing? We use interviews when facts and numerical data are not enough to answer our research questions. We use interviews when it is impossible directly to observe what we are interested in. So people's opinions cannot be observed. We need to ask them. Whenever we are interested in views, opinions, perceptions, feelings, we ask people, we interview them. Whenever we need explanations, details, stories, accounts of people's lives, we ask them, we interview them. Okay. All right. So here's an activity for you guys. Do we use interviews for the following research problems? For the first one, let's take a look. Students' views on learning identity through a tale of two cities. Let me stop here just a second. 40. All right, yes. Yes, even a conversation can be formal. Between ordinary day-to-day speech and interview is constructed where, okay, all right. Yes, that's right. Back. So now we are going to look at some problems and we are going to decide whether we need an interview for it or not. Students' views on learning identity through a tale of two cities. Are we going to interview for that or are we going to use any other instrument? Okay, yes, we can use interviews because we want to know about the views of students. Can we do it any other way? If we wanted to know about students' views on learning identity, could we do it through any other way other than interviews?
Yes, questionnaires.
Yeah, we could use questionnaires. If we had open-ended questions, it needs a qualitative research, definitely, Habiba. But we could also use questionnaires. Textual analysis, not so much because it's a student's views, okay? If it was just identity through Tale of Two Cities, then you could do it through a textual analysis. But since it's a student's views, Imran, it needs to be. Manu, did you want to say something or did you accidentally turn on your mic? Let's look at the next one. Teachers' use of communicative teaching techniques while teaching literature. Would we use interviews for that or any other instrument? Habiba says we should use observations here. Why, Habiba? Habiba, you can turn on your mic and speak if you like.
Literary articles.
Assalamu alaikum, ma'am.
Wa alaikum assalam. Yes.
Madam, if we observe how teachers use different techniques while teaching literature, I think observation is also one of the methods in qualitative research. So we can also use observations there. Along with many different methods, we can also use it as a tool.
Yes, exactly. I don't think that teachers' use of communicative techniques can be done through any other instruments. I think that observation is the right tool for that. If you want to know whether they're using it or not, you need to go and observe those classes and see if it's actually being used. Okay. Presentation of feminism in a doll's house. Would we use interviews for this? Manur, what do you think? We use theory. Ehtizaz says theory. What about others? Zufsha says textual analysis. Ehtizaz says R for some reason. What does R stand for, Ehtizaz? Parvasha says textual analysis along with open-ended questions. Parvasha, what do you mean? That's fine, Ehtizaz, I know. Feminism would be theory-based. Okay, Aisha. Theory and textual analysis. Yes. Khushbakht, Aliza, Prakash, what do you think? Atiya says analysis and critique. Savera says analysis on the basis of theory. Okay. Textual analysis to analyze the feminist approach. Qualitative. Mariam, how is this qualitative? This is non-empirical, Mariam. Own analysis, not interviews. Okay. We will use feminist theory. Faiza, that's right. Kashif, that's right. Ali Raza says textual analysis. Yes, Mariam. I hope it's clear. Koratulan, please switch off your mic. No need for interview. We've got reply, established theory. A feminism, we will use the essence of internet research. Yes, that's right. Okay. All right. Let's go ahead. I hope that this is clear. Yes, but the topic doesn't say reader's perspective, Halimat. It says presentation of feminism. So we are not going to go with interviews. Here, we are going to go with all right. Varisha. On the basis of your reading, please write your answers to the following questions in the chat. What are the 3 types of interviews? What are the strengths and weaknesses of using interviews? Okay. Those of you who have done the reading, can you please comment on what are the different types of interviews and what are the strengths and weaknesses of using interviews in research? Even if you haven't read it, the second question, you can think about it. A lot of material is disadvantage of interviews. Okay, we get a lot of data. Okay, we use the word data rather than material, Eliza. How about any others? Any other strengths and weaknesses? Biased answers? How biased answers, Aska? Could you explain? Getting clear opinion is one of the advantages. Okay, we can get detailed opinions of people. That's an advantage of interviews. Kiran, Abrar, Farzana, you're not speaking. Mahnur, you're not speaking today. Resham hasn't said much in the class. Some topics are controversial and maybe the interviewee may answer with biasness to its content and theory. Okay. Nadia, I've muted your mic. Your mic was turned on. Okay. Time consuming. Yes, they can be very time consuming. Okay, let me just clarify one thing. Whenever we ask people's opinion about something and they are biased towards it, that's okay. It's you as a researcher who should not be biased. People's biasness is your data. The students were biased towards a certain teacher or towards a certain text or towards a certain methodology. That will be your data. That's okay. You will write that down, you will explain it, and that's fine. However, you as a researcher should not be biased. Okay. Misbah, could you put it in the chat for everyone? That's a good response. That's fine for Zana. It'll be helpful for us to reach the conclusion. We have various opinions. So we have rich data. That's the point that you're making, is that we have rich data. Imran is saying that there might be other perspectives than those highlighted by the researcher. That's completely okay. That's not a weakness. Unexpected results are a strength of qualitative research. Okay. Yes. Okay. All right. Moving on. Types of interviews. There are 3 types of interviews. structured, unstructured, and semi-structured. Okay. So we have something called an interview schedule. Okay. Interview schedule or an interview protocol. The questions, the list of questions that you have that you want to ask the interviewee is called an interview schedule or an interview protocol. And based on how organized that is, we have these 3 kinds of interviews. So let's take a look at them. Okay. So structured interviews are those. These interviews are very similar to a questionnaire survey. The interviewer reads out questions word for word. So you just read out each question on your interview schedule. And interviewee often must respond using predefined categories. So sometimes these are closed questions. But it does allow some scope for open questions too. Now this is very organized. You have a specific schedule and you ask questions word to word from that. There is no flexibility in this kind of interview. It's structured. Structured means organized, right? So it's very organized. You have a specific list of questions. You ask those questions, interviewees answer, and that's it. However, it's less common in literature and it's more common in market research and government surveys. You know, the kind of interviews when you go to a supermarket and they want to quickly ask you a few questions and they write down the answers. That's the kind of interview that this is. Okay. It's for market research and government surveys where, like, if you were doing a questionnaire in a supermarket, if they gave us a questionnaire, we'll never return it, right? So they do a quick interview with us. It's a structured interview. It's almost like a questionnaire survey, but it's verbal, so it's an interview. Okay, does that make sense? Aisha, making interviewee comfortable is, yes, Samra, I'll repeat it. Making interviewee comfortable is not an advantage, it's just the process. Okay. I'll repeat structured interviews. Structured interviews are those in which we have a designed interview schedule. So we have a complete list of questions that we need to ask from an interviewer. And there is no flexibility in it. So we cannot move away from those questions. We ask those, we note down the answers or we record the answers, and that's it. Okay. Most of the times it's used in market research or in government surveys. All right, Samra, does that make sense now? That's good. All right, moving on. The next one is unstructured interview. So structured is on the one end and unstructured is on the other extreme. It's where you do not have any set questions. So you don't have a specific interview schedule. All you have is the areas that you wish to cover. So it's a list of topics that you have. Rather than a list of questions, you have a broad list of topics. So I want to know about their education, I want to know about their family background, and I want to know their perceptions on learning fiction. So I have 3 areas that I want to cover. I don't have specific questions designed beforehand. Okay. So it's more informal than structured interviews. And it doesn't necessarily have to be in a specific order. You can go with the flow. You can go like a conversation. And it tends to be informal. So we do not have very set questions. We have a broad list of topics. Usually ethnographic researchers used it. Sociology, people who study sociology would use it. People who study anthropology will use it. So they try to be informal because they do not want their participants to feel uncomfortable. They want to do it as much as possible like a conversation, okay? Even though they are collecting data, even though it's a research interview, but they try to keep it informal so that it goes with the flow. It's like a conversation, okay? Does that make sense? Clear to everybody? Okay to move on? Resham is here. Semi-structured interviews. Now this is somewhere in the middle, somewhere between the two other types. So it's less formal than structured and less informal than unstructured. It's somewhere in the middle between those two. It's not as organized as structured, but it's not as unorganized as unstructured. So what happens? Interviewer has a list of questions that they will try to cover, like a structured interview. We have a list of questions or question areas that he or she will try to cover. But there is some scope of changing order, following up on interesting topics. If they say something that you're interested in, you can ask why, how, you can ask a follow-up question. So there is some flexibility here. In semi-structured interviews, you are prepared to ask specific questions, but you also have some scope for flexibility. These are the most common type of interviews used in qualitative research. Okay. Is that okay? Is that clear? So semi-structured interviews are those in which you have a list of questions, but there is room to change order or to ask follow-up questions. So there is some flexibility on the part of the interviewer to change some questions or to ask follow-up questions. Okay. And these are the most common ones. Imran says it's clear. How about the others? Kashif says it's clear. Okay. Which of these types is the most effective, or is it a topic? Yes, it's your topic which helps you decide. Most of the times, if you're looking for perceptions of students, I would go with semi-structured interviews, because being new researchers going completely unprepared, like unstructured interviews, it would be not so good for you guys, because you might forget, you might not be able to form your questions on the spot. So having a list of questions helps. And plus, since we are looking for detailed answers, we're looking for rich data, then we should leave some room for follow-up questions. So semi-structured interviews tend to be the most effective in the kind of research that we do as students of literature. Yes, Nimra, you're right. Okay, if you're seeking students' perceptions on identity in a novel, questions for an interview schedule or protocol or guide can be, you can ask them to introduce, so you can introduce them to the project. You can ask them, do you enjoy reading novels? If they say yes, you ask them for examples, details. So it's a semi-structured interview. You can ask follow-up questions. And then you ask them, did you like reading this specific novel, the one that you're doing your research on? Then do you think the theme of identity is presented in the novel? Can you give any examples of instances when the theme of identity is depicted? Do you find any relevance of this theme with your life or society? You can connect it with your life, and any other comments. Okay, so these are the this is the kind of interview schedule or interview guide that you can use if you're asking students or readers some questions about the novels that they have studied. Okay, I'll give you one more example. Once you've taken a look at it, I'll give you a moment to go through it. This will help you when you're designing your own interview questions. This is the other one. I'll ask you to please go through it. So if you were doing an interview with teachers of fiction on the impact of fiction on students' perceptions, you could have these questions. Please go through the question. All right, done. Does that make sense? Anything needs clarity? Moving on, strengths of interviews. So why do we do interviews? Because they provide us rich data. It is in depth. We can ask our respondents for more detail. We can ask them to provide us answers to follow-up questions. So we get very rich data. We can cover many aspects of the same answers in that. Interviews also help us discover unexpected data. So we might be biased towards something. We might think that we need certain answers to these questions, but we can get some unexpected answers. Okay, we might get certain unexpected data, and that's a good thing. You discover something that you were not even expecting. So that's a positive aspect of interviews. They are good for answering the why question. You might have some data um, that is easily available. So like female students, there are less female students in schools as compared to male students. Why? You will interview them. Okay, you will interview parents, you will interview teachers, and you will be able to find the answer. As it is a detailed conversation, context becomes very clear. So when you're doing questionnaires, people write certain answers, but since you're not able to ask them any follow-up question, the context of the answer is not very clear. The whole situation is not clear to you. But in this one, the context becomes very clear. In interviews, you can ask about their explanations. You can ask them to explain the scenario to you, so you would be able to understand the context clearly as well. Okay. Weaknesses of interviews, there are a number of weaknesses. There is question of the data's reliability. As the interviewer is present and through their language and expression, the interviewee can know their bias, right? So when we are asking something, we have a specific view in our mind as well, right? So say, for example, if I was doing an interview with my colleagues about teaching literature in large classes, And I believe that teaching literature in large classes is very difficult and we have limited resources. So we're not able to do many activities. So when I ask questions from the respondents, my expressions will show what I think. So it's very difficult for a person to be in front of another and not be affected by their views. So that bias is there. Okay. And that affects the reliability of the data. So was it really that person's opinion, or was it me who affected their opinion? Are you getting it? So we as people sometimes we have this need to please, right? We try not to get into a conflict in a conversation. We try to do what the other person wants us to do, right? Say for example, if I ask you, was it clear? Most of you would say yes. It takes a lot of effort to say no, because that's not what I was expecting. I was expecting you to say yes, right? So whenever that bias is there, the data's reliability is affected, because we don't know whether the interviewee has given their own opinion or were they affected by our expressions and our views. Does that make sense? Samra says yes. Okay. Alisa, we have hypothesis more commonly in quantitative research. Qualitative research, we don't usually have a hypothesis. Generalizability is not possible in qualitative research as there are limited participants, okay? It's very time consuming, but it's less time consuming as compared to observation. It's more time consuming as compared to questionnaires, okay? So arranging interviews. Now we need to think about, yes, what's the problem, Imran? Please go ahead.
Hello, ma'am.
Yes.
Ma'am, the reliability of data, as you said, can be affected by the biasness of the interviewee. But the problem is that biasness, when we are conducting a subjective interview, is always a subjective thing. So biasness will be stemming from two things. Like you said, if you ask a teacher that is it possible to maintain the large classes, like teacher will try to distort, despite knowing that it is possible, he or she will try to distort that it is not possible, and that will be clear on his face, etc. But another biasness that will be stemming from the predetermined belief of the interview, that will be difficult to distinguish from his response and his biases. Like if someone is asked that what is your perception on doll's house, is it okay to allow feminist tendencies to seep into the society or not? Now at that moment, if someone is religiously so fundamental and patriarchally so motivated, his despite his realization will not allow him to say what is right. He will be affected by his pre-held belief. So it is also a kind of biasness. How could we distinguish such biasness?
So you're talking about the biasness of the person that we are taking the data from.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Now, as I was saying before, our job as a researcher is to remove the bias in ourselves. Okay. That's easier as compared to removing the bias in the interviewee. The interviewer's job is to make sure that we do not have any bias. Okay, so there's this social desirability effect that I've written on the whiteboard here. It's also called Hawthorne Effect, based on the person who talked about it first. Okay, this is when we are in a conversation, we try to say what the other person wants to hear. So our biasness the researcher's biasness will affect the response of the respondent. So that is something that we need to work on and we need to remove. The other bias that you talked about, the bias in people's conversation, that's a part of your data. You don't need to remove it. You need to report it. Okay. So if you are asking them about feminism and you see that their views are hindered by their own preconceived notions, their views are affected by their patriarchal mindset, then you will report that in your findings. You will say that a lot of participants were not able to see feminism in Doll's House because they belong to a patriarchal society. So that will be part of your data. That will be part of your findings and your analysis. We don't need to remove that bias. We need to report that. Okay, does that make sense, Imran?
Yes, ma'am, it makes sense, but there is a problem again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure.
Like if we are conducting the interview of a BS final year, for example,
Mm-hmm.
we cannot, interview each and everyone. So we will try to, select 2 or 3 females and 2 or 3 boys. And accidentally, if we, choose someone who is already most affected and his or her beliefs and perception are quite contrary to what the majority of classes thinks. So in this regard, we will be reporting that majority of class thinks that they do not have any kind of effect of fam goes out.
Okay.
What in such situation, what could we do?
We never, this point here, generalizability is not possible in qualitative research. So in qualitative research, we do not claim that we are reporting majority of the class. We claim that we are reporting only those 6 students that we have interviewed. Okay. So since qualitative research goes for in-depth answers for each of the participants, we are only responsible for those participants that we have interviewed. We are not going to claim that this is generalizable to the whole class, because qualitative research does not do that. If you're interested in generalizability, you will have to do quantitative research, because there you will select a larger sample. And when you're selecting sample, you will be taking care of many different factors. So you will be ensuring that the sample that you select is actually representative of the population that you are selecting it from. So the people that you select are the sample, and the ones that you're selecting it from is the population, right? So the sample in qualitative research is very small. So if you're taking 6 participants out of a class of 150, you cannot claim that those 6 represent those 150. So you're only responsible for those 6 people's views. And what's the most that we can claim? We can say that this gives us some insight into what undergraduate students at English department think. That's the most that you can claim. You cannot claim that this is what all students will think. Does that make sense?
That's clear. Thank you, ma'am.
Okay, right. Let's move on. Arranging interviews. So whenever you're arranging interviews, you need to consider a few things. So you need to think about noise levels, because we usually record interviews, and whenever sometimes students record it and then later when they're listening to it, there's a lot of noise in the background and they're not able to write it. So you need to think about those things beforehand. Where exactly are you going to set it up? Are the noise levels going to be okay? Are you going to be comfortable there? Are you considering the interviewee's choice? Have you asked them whether they will be comfortable there? Confirm arrangements in writing, and again, say by phone beforehand. So a lot of people will tell you that they will give you an interview, but if you don't confirm with them the day before, then they're not going to give it to you. Okay. A lot of people go back on their word. This happens in data collection a lot. So you need to confirm your arrangements. There are certain ethical consideration. Whenever you're collecting data from actual people, you need to get informed consent from them. You need to inform them that this is what the project is about. You need to tell them that I am going to use your data like this, and then you need to take consent from them. Okay, so what we usually do is we make a form where we write what the project is about, who's our supervisor, and how the data will be used, and whether it would be voluntary, whether it will be anonymous, and then we ask them to sign it. So it's important that you consider the ethics of it. And when you're asking people about, yes, that's right, Aisha. When you're asking people about sensitive data, you need to be very careful because there are a lot of moral issues involved. You're not supposed to disturb people with your interviews. You need to be very careful with your language, and you need to inform them beforehand about how exactly you're going to use it. And because you want unbiased data, you want them to freely speak, you want them to be comfortable, then you should assure them that this will be anonymous. You're not going to take their names. So in research, we don't use people's names. We try and avoid it as much as possible. They should not be identifiable. Okay. So if I'm taking data from Halimat, Azga, Imran, and Shehrbano from your class, then I would not be writing your exact names, and I would not be writing names that can be traced back to you. Okay, so I'll give you numbers, or I'll give you fake names that are not traceable. All right, so you need to think about those things. You need to think about personal safety as well. So don't go to a stranger's house to do an interview. Think about those things beforehand. Okay, timing. What we do is whenever we have a set of questions, we have an interview guide with us. We try and do the interview with a friend or with a prospective participant and note the timing so that we can tell our participants beforehand that I'll need 30 minutes of your time for this. I'll need 20 minutes of your time for this. So you know the timing of the interview and you select it accordingly. You inform them accordingly. Okay. People are giving you their time, right? Time is a very precious thing if you think about it. And why should anybody give you their time? So you need to be very considerate in asking for an interview. Most of the times, in your case, you would be interviewing your friends, so you can request them, or you can tell them that you have to do it. But sometimes when you are doing it with strangers, when you're doing it with teachers, and you need to be very considerate of all these issues. Okay. In preparation, you would need to think about sampling. All right. So what is a sample? We have two things. We have a sample and a population. Population is all possible participants. So if you're saying readers' perceptions on Waiting for Godot, then all possible readers, all the readers of Waiting for Godot are your population. Sample is the people selected for data in your study. Okay, so sample is a small number from the population that you have selected to collect data. Okay. So if you're saying that I will be looking at BS final year students' perceptions Waiting for Godot, then BS final year is your population, and the 10 people that you're interviewing will be your sample. Okay, does that make sense? Anybody to whom it's not clear, I can explain it again. If it's not clear, please say it and I'll repeat it. So if topic is BS final year students' perceptions of existentialism in the plague, then population is BS final year, and sample is 10 selected participants. Okay, better? Whenever we collect an interview, we record it and then we write it down. Okay, so we record the interview. Audio recording is fine. You do it on your phones, you do it on your laptops, any devices. You can have an audio recorder with you, and then you can write it down. Okay. Temur, population is larger. Sample is a smaller part of that population. Habiba, I just answered your question. Was it not clear? What I'm saying is that in interviews, it's always verbal. Okay, you record it and then you write it down later. You can take notes during that. If you want to make a note of any gestures or any expressions, you can write it down. And then later on, you transcribe the whole thing. You write down the whole thing. Habiba, could you open your mic and speak? I'm not clear. That's a questionnaire. If you're sending them questions through email, then that's a questionnaire. That's not an interview. Okay. Halimat is asking, is it okay to make a video recording? People usually do not give consent for video recording. Okay, it's very difficult to get consent. It's okay to do it if they give you permission, but it's difficult. Video recordings are more common in observations. Habiba, is it clear now? And Temur, is it clear about population and sample? Okay. So you need to think about who you want to interview. Okay. So you have said BS final year students. Do you want to select five girls, 5 boys? Do you want to do people of different backgrounds? Do you want to do people from public sector schools and private sector schools? Do you want to do people from rural and urban background? So what exactly are the factors that you think might affect the perceptions of those people? And then accordingly, you should choose your participants. So there should be some thought into selecting your participants. Sometimes when we do not have access, we select those who are available, and that's called convenience sampling, and that's also okay. Question schedule, also called protocol or guide. So you can design a list of topics to cover rather than exact words of questions, or you can do it ordered but be flexible, like in semi-structured interviews. They should be linked to your research questions. Okay. The questions that you design, they need to be linked to your research questions. You cannot ask just random questions. You need to give some thought into developing that interview protocol, that interview guide. You need to think about practical issues, like remember the interviewee's name. Don't do so many interviews that you don't even remember their name. Always have pen and paper, batteries, if you have a voice recorder. Charge your phone if you're recording on that. Put it on flight mode so that the calls don't disturb you in the middle. Close the door so that people do not disturb you, things like that, right? So think about those practical issues. During the interview, think about which language to use. This is important because there are going to be people who are not going to be comfortable with answering you in English, right? So if you take an interview in English, you might not get as rich data as you might get in Sindhi or Urdu. So if I were to talk to you in English, obviously there is some communication barrier. Depends on the level of level of their competence as well, language competence that people have. Plus, people are more comfortable in their mother tongue, right? Sure, Manur, I'll go back to the previous slide. Yes. Manur, did you have a question about this? Okay, all right. Is that fine? Can we go ahead now? Great. Right. So you need to think about which language to use, but whichever language you use, you need to report that in your methodology. So when you write your thesis, you're going to write in your methodology, whether you have chosen Sindhi or Urdu or English to speak to your participants and why, what issues did that create? And then when you were translating it from Sindhi to English to report it, what did you think about? So all those things need to be reported. And you need to consciously think of those things and give those reasons in your methodology section. Okay. It is important how you introduce yourself and the topic. So you need to think about how much you want to give away about the topic. What exactly do you want to tell the participants? You should not be telling your opinions when you're introducing it. Just a brief introduction is enough most of the times. So think about that. Then remove researcher bias. Try not to have your own views about the topic told to the participants. Talking and listening, getting the right balance. Some people talk a lot. Some respondents will talk a lot and they will go away from the topic. So you need to bring them back. You need to use your follow-up questions in a way that they come back to the topic. Sometimes people don't speak. Some people would give you answers in yes or no, and that's not what you want in an interview. You want more detailed answers. So you need to get the right balance between talking and listening. Sometimes you need to give them some time to think. Stay quiet so that they would speak. Silence usually helps. So don't be uncomfortable with silence. Give them some time to think and answer. Don't talk too much. Give them time to talk because it's their data that's important. But also talk at times when it's needed so that you can ask them a follow-up question and then you can bring them back to the topic. Okay. Do's. Listen and pay attention always. Okay. I was collecting data for my PhD, and one of the participants, when I was doing an interview, somebody knocked on the door. We were in the department. We were doing it in an office of a colleague, and this was a student that I hadn't taught because I was doing my PhD, and I was on study leave, so they didn't know me. And somebody knocked on the door, they came in, they talked to me, and they stayed for a couple of minutes and then they went away. And when I got back to the interviewee, they said, so what were we talking about? And they were checking actually whether I was paying attention to their answer or not. And I told him what we were talking about, and he said, I was just checking you. So it's very important to the person that you are taking the interview from that you listen to them. Okay. Because they're giving you their time and they're giving you data that you need. So they're doing you a favor. So you need to pay attention to them and react to the situation. Whatever they're saying, you need to nod, you need to say yes, oh, really, things like that. So respond to it. Every interview is different. So do it according to that interview. Try to avoid putting across your own opinion. Don't say too much about your own opinions. Stay for long enough to get useful data and be polite. Okay, always be polite. Don't. What are the things that you shouldn't do? Ask leading questions. So don't lead them towards a direction. Don't say, don't you think that teaching in large classes is not very good? That's a leading question. Okay. Don't ask biased questions. So if you are doing an interview on religious views and existentialism in Waiting for Godot, then you you could have some biases. Don't put them in your questions. Don't use jargon. So language that is specific to your field, don't use that, because the interviewee, sorry, is not supposed to know your terminology. So don't say, what do you think about Beauvoir's concept of feminism? They're not supposed to know what is Beauvoir's concept of feminism. It's you who are supposed to know it. You're supposed to simplify it. Okay. Don't ask long or confusing questions. Don't stay for too long. Avoid questions where the answer is yes or no. Okay. You need to simplify it as much as possible, Aisha. So you need to simplify your questions so that the answer is clear to the respondents. The respondents should be clear about what you need from the question. So design your questions accordingly and test it with a friend. Okay. What we usually do is, when we design a questionnaire, we test it with a friend, with a colleague, so that we can then ask in a proper manner from our real respondents. We call it pilot. So you need to test before you do the actual data collection. All right. Be reflexive. So keep thinking, use probes and prompts, use follow-up questions. Think of how to deal with silence, how much silence is necessary. Think of the shape of an interview. So there should be a beginning, there should be a middle, there should be an end. You should be properly organized. Recording of the interview is highly recommended. Obviously, and not all participants will be comfortable with that. Ask them if this is okay. Use good quality equipment, check it is working, and try to interview in a suitably noise-free environment. Okay. Sometimes people talk after the interview as well. There are some afterthoughts. Maybe you can keep recording, or you can take notes. You can take notes about basic details: time, date, interviewee, characteristics, sometimes gestures, expressions. Initial thoughts, you should write your initial thoughts after the interview. Your data analysis is starting here, right? So you have listened to the interview and you want to note down everything before it skips your mind or before you move on to the next interview. Leave a gap before the next interview. Don't do them back to back, because you will need time to process your thoughts and write them down. Okay. All right. Now, for the next class, we have a task. You're all supposed to do it in your own time. We want to research university students' reasons for choosing literature. So in third year, you had an option to choose literature or linguistics. Or in first year, you had an option to come to this department. What were your reasons? Okay. What you are supposed to do is, you are supposed to design an interview schedule. 5 interview questions should be there in an interview schedule, in your interview schedule. We don't always need 5 questions. There's usually more, but you are going to design an interview schedule with 5 questions, and you will conduct interview with a friend, record the audio. Okay, so you can do it over a phone call, you can do it over Zoom, and you can easily record it. And then listening to the audio, write everything down. When you write everything down, that's it. That's called an interview transcript. Okay, so you will say, then the respondent R said this, I said this, respondent said this, I colon. Okay, let me show you how. Respondent said, I'm fine. And then I said, can I start the questions? So everything that you say, yes, please. Okay, and so on. So your interview transcript needs to be written. Okay. Nimra, could you put it in the chat for everyone? Nimra, I think you're talking about data analysis. We have not reached there. We will talk about analysis later, okay? Right now, we need to collect data. When we have done with collecting, then we will talk about how we need to write it in the end, okay? So is the task clear? Everyone is supposed to do one interview and bring it to the class on data analysis. We are in week 7 now. In week 9, we will have the class on data analysis, and I want each one of you to bring the transcript to the class. Can we do that? Everyone is supposed to write down an interview schedule, 5 questions, conduct an interview or based on that interview schedule with a friend, listen to that audio, write it down, email that transcript, to your CRs. Okay, Kashif, are you going to do it? Yes, Ali Raza, thank you. Okay. Usman, how about you? All right, so this is the task for week 9. You're supposed to email your interview transcripts to the CR. For next week, we are going to do observations. PDF of the book is already on your group, so read chapter 18. I will specify which sections specifically you need to read, okay? I'll put a post on your group and I'll specify. Yeah, that's fine. You can email it to me as well, no problem. There can be both questions, Habiba, closed-ended as well as open-ended in structured interview. If our topic requires approximately 10 people to be interviewed, so the people I'm easily accessible to, I would hardly find any reader of the novel. Data which had to be collected from a number of people. Okay, so you should think about these issues before you select a topic. If you don't know anybody who has read that novel, then you shouldn't select that topic, okay? So you can interview from 10 people who are easily accessible to you, that's okay. And you should always select a topic where you can actually get participants who will give you data for that, okay? So make it easy for yourself. We will talk about sampling a bit in next week's class, okay? The kinds of sampling and how you can select participants. But there is no other way, okay? What we usually do is we email people. Sometimes I get emails from strangers asking for data collection, requesting for data collection. Sometimes I reply, sometimes I don't reply, right? So you can email people, you can request them through friends. For the task, you need to interview with one friend, yes. Do we have any other questions? For this one, I have given you a topic, Savera. For the task, I have given you the topic, so you have to interview them regarding their choice of literature. Why did they choose literature? And you have to design questions accordingly. Imran, could you put it in the chat for everyone? Any other questions? All right, great. So please do the reading for the next